Okay, well, good evening and welcome to this talk into the Festival Ideas. My name is Tim Doran. I'm Professor of Health Policy at the University of York, and I'm going to be hosting our speaker this evening. So, to introduce our speaker, we're very privileged to have Colin Elliott, who's an Associate Professor of History at Indiana University in the US, but he's actually joining us from Milan today. He's on a grand European tour. And not only is he a professor at Indiana, he's a podcast host, so you can hear him on the Pax Romana podcast. So today, Colin's going to be sharing highlights from his new book, Pox Romana, which explores the sudden sickness that struck the legions and laid waste to cities, including Rome itself, in the middle of the 2nd century AD. And it's a fast-spreading disease, which is now known as the Antonine plague. And it may have been history's first pandemic, but Colin will talk to us about that. And soon after its arrival, the empire began a downward trajectory leading to its decline and fall. So a few questions that hopefully we're going to try and answer today. Was this a single disease? Its origins and diagnosis is still a mystery. What was it that actually brought Rome down to its knees? And so hopefully shining a light on all that is Colin. I'll hand you over to Colin now. So Colin, over to you.
Thanks a bunch, Tim. And of course, I want to say thanks to the organizers for inviting me. What an honor and just an exciting opportunity to get to speak to this audience about the topic. So I'm going to share with you some of the research that I have been doing over the past few years, investigating what Tim was talking about, what I think was the world's first pandemic. It was called the Antonine Plague. It struck the Roman Empire around the year AD 165. It lasted at least a decade, could have been longer. We'll talk a little bit about that. And it killed several million people. The evidence that I want to share with you tonight, by the way, comes from across the Roman Empire, even a little bit beyond. And so in order to keep you informed of what you're seeing on the screen and really where it comes from, you'll just want to look for a small map in the lower right-hand corner of your screen. So just look for that. There will be a little circle around the part of the Roman world where that evidence comes from. So just pay attention to that. Okay, this is not a modern map of the European motorway system. This is a map in front of you of what the road network looked like in the Roman Empire around the year AD 160. And by that year, the Roman Empire had enjoyed more than a century of uninterrupted dominance. And we call this age of efflorescence and prosperity the Pax Romana. That means the Roman peace. Rome ruled a vast territorial empire across parts of 3 different continents: Europe, North Africa, and West Asia. Roughly 3 million square miles of land and sea. Something like 50 to 60 million people lived in this territory. Just so you know, for perspective, that's about a quarter of the population of planet Earth at the time. One of the strengths of this vast and well-populated empire was its connectivity. And as you might imagine, that plays a role in the spread of disease, and I'll get to that in just a second. Obviously, we're looking at a road network in front of you, but also uniting and connecting the Roman Empire was what the Romans called Mare Nostrum, that is, our sea. And so for around 7 months of the year, the calm waters of the Mediterranean during late spring to early autumn allowed ships of a variety of sizes to move from coastal town to coastal town, and in some cases quite large vessels, some of them as large as 150 feet long or more, to move across from ports, say, from Alexandria in Egypt over to Rome in Italy. What also made this age a particularly optimistic one in which the Romans believed the eternal empire would last forever, was who was in charge. So in the year 161, we get 2 men for the very first time appointed to rule the Roman Empire. These are on the left side of your screen, Marcus Aurelius. You can always find him with his scraggly Greek philosopher's beard. He stylized himself, as many of you will know, of course, as a philosopher king, a wise man, a stoic, a far-seeing ruler. And then the guy on the right of your screen, a little bit handsomer, that is Lucius Verus. That's Marcus's adoptive brother. He's about 30 years old in the year 161. He's an adventurer, a military commander, and just sort of a man's man in many ways, leading the Roman Empire along with Marcus Aurelius. So it looked like Rome had never been stronger. And when these two men took over, there was no indication whatsoever that this stunningly prosperous empire was about to be shaken from a crisis from which it really would never recover. And I'm sorry to say that that's exactly what happened. And so tonight I want to examine the Antonine Plague. I want to talk first about what it was. And it's a bit of a mystery, as we'll see. Historians have never been able to determine what disease was responsible, how far it spread, how many people it killed, what role it played in the collapse of the Pax Romana. And so I'd like to start by telling you what we know from the precious few written accounts from people who lived in the Roman Empire, either at the time of the Antonine Plague or just after. Then what I want to get into is some of the material that I think makes the book that I just wrote unique. That is, I want to show you why Rome was so susceptible to this pandemic. And really, there are some big surprises here. So I'm giving away a little bit. One of the surprises is that some of the sources of Rome's strength, so its connectivity, its military power, these things also helped spread disease. The second surprise is revealed by new scientific research on the ancient climate. So as it turns out, nature was conspiring against the Roman Empire even before the pandemic began. Finally, then, I want to spend just a few minutes, 10 minutes or so at the end, talking about the broader effects of the Antonine Plague pandemic. We know, obviously, from our own experience that a pandemic is not just a disease event. A pandemic can be an economic and social and cultural and political experience. And a powerful pandemic can also be a catalyst for rapid changes, even long after the disease itself dissipated. And I want to remind you of something which I'll bring up a few times in the talk, but it bears repeating. The Antonine Plague was the first pandemic that anyone had ever experienced. It was the first time that a disease was perceived to strike anybody anywhere. And there was no reliable way to treat it, and there was no escape from it. All right, so I want to start where the ancient sources start, and that is in Persia in the year AD 165. The Roman Empire was in the midst of a war with their ancient nemesis, the Parthian Empire. That's the empire that ruled the territory of Persia, Mesopotamia, and a bit beyond. In the year 165, the Romans had been in a war with the Parthians for several years. Lucius Verus, the second of the two emperors, was leading that war, although not really. He was basically hanging out in Antioch, going on vacation, hunting, boozing, that sort of thing. But he gets credit for the war because in 165, it starts to go very, very well. The Roman army marched down the Euphrates River. You can see that there right in the center of your screen. They sacked the city of Seleucia, one of those dots again right near the middle of your screen. And we're told in the sources that the city of Seleucia housed a shrine of Apollo. If you know anything about Apollo, you will know that he is the god of light. He is an averter of evil, but he is also a bringer of pestilence. And so we're told that the Roman soldiers broke into Apollo's holy sanctuary, and they were groping about for treasures, and they started smashing jars and prying open cracks in the wall and crevices, and the looters unsealed a nasty surprise. So this is what Ammianus Marcellinus tells us, the late 4th century AD historian, that the soldiers found a pestilence loaded with the force of incurable disease, which in the time of Lucius Verus and Marcus Antoninus polluted the whole world from the borders of Persia to the Rhine and Gaul with contagion and death. Now, we can't take this account at face value. We don't know if such a shrine existed in Seleucia. We don't even know if the city was truly gripped by an epidemic at the time that the Romans sacked it. We do know that directly following the war with Parthia, that a disease unlike anything the world had ever seen swept through several cities and regions of the Roman Empire. So even if this story is only partly true, there is a connection there, certainly, between the timing of the war and the pandemic. And I'll go into more detail about whether those two things are really causally related in just a minute. This disease, what was it? It was a mystery then. We still don't know what it was to this day. It is one of history's great unsolved mysteries. For example, we talk about the Antonine plague. This disease, though, probably wasn't the plague, that is, bubonic plague. We only have scattered notes in the corpus of a very famous Greek physician. His name was Galen. Galen witnessed and treated this disease. We know from his notes that victims first suffered a fever that lasted several days. From there, they developed diarrhea with blood-blackened stool. And if, by the way, if that happened, Galen says that they were almost certainly going to die. Some victims' breath became foul. They started coughing up blood and sometimes ulcery scabs. I hope you ate a light meal tonight. Unsurprisingly, many had trouble sleeping. Other victims developed a dry pustular rash. And in some cases, bleeding under the skin produced blackened ulcers or pustules, which scabbed over and then fell away like husks. That's what Galen said, that they fell away like husks and may have left behind scars. His language is Greek on that, is a little bit hard to decipher. But the pustular rash, that part of the symptoms, sounds eerily similar to several known pox viruses. Although we do know it was not modern smallpox, we've only recently in the last few years gotten some good genetic evidence that confirms that modern smallpox is only about 500 years old. So we have those symptoms, we have Galen's notes, but the disease continues to be a mystery to us, as it was to the Romans. But we do know that the disease was highly contagious, and we also know that it was deadly. It made its way to Rome just 1 year later, AD 166. And the first time that it is ever mentioned in a source is right in front of you here, and it is quite jarring. The emperors were back in Rome, both Lucius Verus and Marcus Aurelius, celebrating the victory against the Parthians, and they were then preparing a new war with Germanic tribes, celebrating a festival. And then we get this entry. This is exactly what we read in the biography of Marcus Aurelius. It says, and there was such a pestilence that the dead were removed in carts and wagons. So heaps of bodies overwhelmed the city of Rome. It appears that there was really no warning. We know from other ancient accounts of urban epidemics that with bodies piling up like this, any body collectors that were tasked to do this grisly work would be very quickly overwhelmed. We know that there was a problem here because the next line speaks about the emperors ratifying laws, very stringent laws on burials and tombs. We know that the Romans were typically very reverent about burial rituals and funerary rites, and evidently the protocols were just being tossed to the wind. Perhaps corpses were being thrown into bushes, into the Tiber, stuffed down the sewers, stuffed into tombs that didn't belong to people. We know that the chaos was such that even Marcus and Lucius felt the need to pass laws. And we see here really the emperors doing what they could. They couldn't stop this disease. It was affecting everybody. And yet what they could do was, in the midst of a period of social fragility, remind people of their dignity. Marcus and Lucius dipped into state funds to pay for memorial services. We read about that in this same source. Funeral ceremonies performed for the lower classes. Statues were erected for the victims from the nobility. And I think that Marcus and Lucius were not only trying to just rid the city of bodies, but again, trying to remind Romans of their dignity and their humanity in the midst of a repugnant pandemic. So, in part due to the pandemic, the emperors had to halt their plans for their war against the German tribes. In the meantime, the Germans were happy to take this as a green light to go ahead and start invading Roman territory. And that's exactly what they did. They pillaged cities in the Balkans. They defeated Roman soldiers that were stationed along the border. And you can see those little fort icons along the Danube River there on the map, just above that kind of pinkish purplish section. While during this invasion, a Roman governor was killed, and probably the most symbolically devastating aspect of this invasion, if you follow the brown line down to the Italian city of Aquileia, the heart of the Roman Empire was, for the first time in centuries, attacked. The province of Italy was attacked, and the city of Aquileia, which was a city of military veterans, a city with walls, was besieged for a period of time, probably around 168. The sources are such that we don't know the exact year that all of this happened. What we do know is that this constituted another emergency. We have the plague striking Rome, and now an emergency, a sort of foreign policy emergency. So the emperors now, both of them, moved their soldiers into Italy and to the city of Aquileia. We know that this happened probably in AD 168 or 169. The city became crammed with Roman soldiers, the retinues of both emperors. Many of these soldiers were fresh recruits from Italy, formed into new legions. And some of the soldiers also were soldiers that had returned from Parthia, who may have been carrying a disease with them. And also, the physician Galen was also summoned to the city of Aquileia, which is why we know what happened next. And this is what Galen tells us. On his arrival in Aquileia, there was an outbreak of plague, which caused destruction on a scale previously unknown. So Galen was clearly terrified, and he was for good reason. Interestingly, we read that Marcus and Lucius, having endured the Roman epidemic wave in AD 166, also recognized the horrors that were upon them in Aquileia. This time there were no acts of nobility, body tidier cleaners, statues, memorial ceremonies. No, the emperors just booked it. They left town, immediately fled the city. Their war, this emergency that caused them to need to plan this war, just totally abandoned. They departed with such speed that they left everybody else there. So we read this: the emperors immediately fled to Rome with a small force of men. For the rest of us, survival became very difficult over a long period. Now, Galen was not British, but you can read the sarcasm and sort of passive aggressiveness in his comment here. He's obviously a little bit bitter about being left all by himself in Aquileia. The majority, in fact, now speaking about the experience, died. The effects of the plague being compounded by the fact that all this was taking place in the middle of winter. So Galen settled in for probably the hardest winter of his life. But as we read further on in this same source, Marcus Aurelius and his co-emperor Lucius Verus, although they attempted to outrun the disease, Lucius Verus, who at this point was 39 years old and in the prime of his life, never made it back to Rome. Lucius Verus died on the journey home. We don't know exactly what killed him. It is interesting that Galen mentions his death in kind of the same breath that he is talking about the plague in Aquileia, but the cause of death here isn't named, so we're left guessing a little bit. However, other parts of the empire too, we have some similar mysteries about about what the cause of death was for so many people. So in the same way, we don't know exactly whether Lucius died of the plague, we have others in the Roman Empire also dying or at least disappearing. So the plague would go on to affect numerous cities across the empire, from cities in Egypt to those all the way on the island of Great Britain. Again, the evidence, though, is a bit tricky, and I want to show you a little bit about what I mean here by just digging into some. So in Egypt, we have very valuable information in census records. We have population figures for several villages in the Nile Delta, both before the years of the plague and then kind of years during or perhaps just slightly after, depending on when exactly it struck Egypt. So we have two different population counts, and the changes in the numbers are simply staggering. You can see them right now on your screen, just some sample villages. These are small villages in the Nile Delta, but they're losing 80, 90% of their population. These are poor, rural villages. Now, not all of these losses, they could not have all been deaths from the pandemic. We know that during this same time, many of these villagers were also facing starvation. There were bandits roaming the areas, attacking and burning villages. The Roman taxation regime was quite onerous in Egypt, such that many villagers fled and did not re-register for the census, so they just sort of disappeared in the records. But clearly, pandemic deaths must have played a role in these figures. We just don't know how much. Similar mysterious information we get from the other side of the empire. So all the way over to the island of Great Britain. There is a noticeable decline in productivity around the time of the Antonine plague. So we know that mills were abandoned in the city of London from archaeological excavations. Kilns stopped producing tiles and bricks. Glass-making workshops near the city's amphitheater suddenly fail. Soil studies from the city of London show that some of the more bustling industrial areas during the first and early second centuries essentially become fallow, open land. There was a quarry on the east side of the city of London that was filled in at the same time. But most dramatically is the information that's in front of you on your screen right now. This is some of some of the data from a 463,000 shard data set of pottery shards recovered from the city of London, generously provided to me by a scholar named Robin Simmons. I'm very gracious to him for sharing with me his work. So he has this huge database of pottery shards. And of course, what we see is what I hope you can see on your screen, that we have high numbers of pottery shards all the way up to the 160s. And then we get the years of the plague, and we get a huge dip. And by the way, this dip will last beyond the Roman Empire itself. So if we extended this chart all the way to the year 400, which is when the database ends, these numbers would still be quite low per decade. Again, 2,000 to 4,000 at most every decade, which is just a small fraction of what they were in the first 2 centuries AD. So London really did not recover during the Roman period. So that got me through, I think, what was the Antonine plague. You should now have a good sense of what it was, and maybe a little bit about some of the mystery that still exists, even after writing a book about the Antonine plague. There are things we still don't really know. I want to now turn to the second question that I asked at the beginning of this talk, which was, why was the Roman Empire susceptible to such a disease outbreak? As it turns out, in a tragic irony of history, some of the very sources of Rome's strength during the Pax Romana, so its connectivity, its military might, its reliance on Egypt for grain production, all of these actually really suddenly transformed into destabilizing weaknesses just before and then during the Antonine Plague. So let me say something about trade. We do not know how the disease responsible for the Antonine Plague first made its way in. Another mystery. Trade seems like a strong possibility, okay? Through Egypt and the Red Sea, the Mediterranean was exposed via trade to the southern Arabian Peninsula, to the eastern coast of Africa, including sub-Saharan Africa, and to the wider world of the Indian Ocean, even to China. Roman ships, again, some of them quite large, 50, 100 feet in length, lined their hulls with olive oil and wine, bringing those products to Indian Ocean ports, and then departing back to Roman territory with luxury goods, spice, ivory. They would ship those, they would unload those in Berenike, one of the ports there on the Red Sea. Those goods would then move by caravan across the desert and then go up the Nile. And then from there, they went into the Mediterranean. So that was the kind of maritime connectivity. And then, of course, there were land routes as well. You can see some of those in green on the map on your screen. These are, of course, the Silk Roads, which connected the four largest empires of Eurasia. In the west, the Roman Empire, then the Parthian Empire, then the Kushan Empire in Central Asia, and lastly, the Han Chinese Empire. And right before the Antonine Plague struck, the links between those empires, both by land and by sea, really had never been stronger. We know that diseases hitched rides along those routes. Even the lonely paths across the empty wilderness of the Silk Roads, the proof is in the poop. So archaeologists recently surveyed latrines along one of the Silk Road routes, confirming the presence of parasites from thousands of miles away. So I think it's worth asking, could traders have carried the Antonine Plague, the disease responsible for the Antonine Plague? I think that seems probable. Around the same time that the pandemic entered the Roman Empire, by the way, we have accounts from Han China and from the southern Arabian Peninsula confirming unusual and frequent outbreaks of disease in those areas. Now, we don't have detailed diagnoses and sort of explanations of symptoms, so we can't for sure say that the same disease was at work in both places. But if even a fraction of the reports that we have from Arabia and Han China even if just a fraction of those are the same disease, then we really begin to have some confirmation that the world's first pandemic struck Eurasia in the middle of the 2nd century AD. But trade is just one. Trade is just one possible way in which this thing would have spread. We also have armies. The Roman military under Marcus Aurelius and Lucius Verus was about 500,000 men strong. That would make it one of the largest armies in pre-industrial history. Roman military camps, in case I'm sure many of you knew this, were larger and more cosmopolitan than many Roman cities. These were camps which were dotted across the boundaries of the empire. They contained thousands of soldiers from a variety of different places, but also an equal or greater number of dependent women and children and servants and merchants and suppliers and messengers, and many other people latched on. And so when the soldiers lingered in garrisons, they were surrounded by large groups of people at the same time. And when soldiers moved, especially in large numbers to fight in Rome's wars, and there were two of them at the same time of the Antonine Plague, they formed a kind of mobile breeding ground for all sorts of microbes. And so for the Antonine Plague, there really could be no better strategic conquest than Rome's legions. And at the beginning of this talk, I mentioned that the Antonine Plague may have affected Roman soldiers during the conquest of Persia in AD 165. Again, the source is a little, we don't know entirely how valid the source is. From there, though, if these soldiers did catch the disease in Persia, then it may have hitchhiked into the cities of the Roman Empire with the soldiers as they returned to their European bases in the following year. And that's what you're looking at on your screen. This is a map that I made with some known waypoints, that is Ephesus, and known destinations of the soldiers that returned from the Parthian War. This would be around 40,000 soldiers marching from Antioch, then to Ephesus, and then fanning out along roughly 4 routes. Several thousand also, you'll see one little strand of these soldier movements going to Rome. This represents several soldiers returning to join the triumphal parade that Lucius Verus celebrated in the city of Rome just ahead of the outbreak in Rome in 166. So you get obviously the soldiers coming directly from Parthia to Rome. Then you get the huge celebration where perhaps hundreds of thousands of citizens in the city would have flocked into the forum along the various spots, the various stops of the parade route. This is a super spreader event, as we've come to call them, on the grandest scale. And then, as you know, because I mentioned it earlier, the first wave of the Antonine Plague hits just a few weeks later. This parade happened on October 12th of 166. The outbreak in Rome follows shortly thereafter. All right, so I also mentioned, though, that nature, too, was preparing the way for the Antonine Plague. And really, this is something that the Romans did not understand was happening. We do, thanks to some new paleoclimatological evidence. So in order to understand modern climate change, scientists increasingly look to the climate of the distant past in some pretty clever ways. So we have, for example, tree rings. You're seeing some of those on the left of your screen. I'm sure that you know this. You may have learned this when you were a kid like I did, that tree rings, by their thickness, trees lay down a new ring every year, and by the color of that ring, by the thickness, by other attributes, it's possible to get a sense as to how much precipitation and sunlight that tree received in each of those years that the ring was made. We also see, for example, in the photo to your right, another climate proxy. So these are ice cores. So snowfall, which accumulates each year in Arctic areas. So these photos are from Greenland, for example. The snow falls each year. It compacts into thick sheets of ancient Arctic ice. And of course, the snow carries with it microscopic particles that tell us about atmospheric conditions thousands of years ago. So these kind of proxies reveal some fascinating insights into the climate of the Roman Empire just around the time that the Antonine Plague struck. So the part of the empire that was most crucial for producing food for the city of Rome and also for its legions, this would be the province of Egypt, and its fields flooded every year with nutrient-rich waters that came down the Nile. But during the plague years, and in fact for about a decade prior to that, there was a pretty serious drought, or at least appears that that was the case in the Nile. We know this from local records, and we know this from climate evidence. So I just want to show you the local records for purposes of time. These come from papyrological records, which when a landowner, when his field did not flood, he wrote a report to a government official saying, hey, my field didn't flood. I can't pay my taxes. Please don't levy taxes on me. I have nothing with which to pay them. And often there would be a report as to how high the flood got. And you want a flood of between 14 and 16 cubits. So what you see on your screen is a set of dotted lines, horizontal lines. Those represent 14 to 16 cubits. So any flood report within that bar is a great flood. All the fields in Egypt get flooded, just the right amount of water tends to lead to a great harvest. There are a few dots that are above that, up in 18. That's bad. That's too much flood. Buildings get destroyed. Fields get ruined. The canals get overrun. It's very, very bad. The irrigation systems get blocked up. It's terrible if the flood goes higher than 16 cubits. Similarly, when the flood is below that lower dotted line, 14 cubits and below, the lower it goes, the worse the harvest is, because the flood just simply does not reach all the fields. And if you get a year that's particularly bad, like 12 cubits or 11 cubits, a good chunk of Egypt does not actually get the water that it needs in order to produce the kind of grain that the Romans had come to rely on for feeding the population of Rome and for feeding their soldiers. And what you're seeing on your screen is that from some of these papyrological records at around 150 AD, just a little bit after, this is a decade and a half before the Antonine plague struck, the Nile floods begin to fail. We see about 9 out of the 30 years between AD 150 and 180 were years with excellent floods. So the others, we either don't have information or they were poor or destructive floods. So that's worth pointing out, because again, why does this matter to the Antonine plague? Egypt fed the city of Rome. It also fed tens of thousands of Roman soldiers. These were the same populations that were hit the hardest during the Antonine plague, people in the cities and people among and soldiers. So without a stable food supply ahead of the Antonine plague, these individuals became malnourished. Malnourished people lack the micro and macronutrients necessary to fight disease. It was even worse than that, though. Not only were things going wrong in Egypt, they were going wrong elsewhere too. So when Egypt failed, pressure was placed on local grain production in Europe. We know from tree rings in that region that parts of Europe also suffered short-term droughts at almost exactly the same time. So here are some tree ring records that were recovered from Austria and Finland. They show a drought right around the year 150. Standard index is 0. So below that line, the tree rings reflect a period of lower precipitation, lower sunlight. So we've got a pronounced period of drought in parts of Europe, the same time that we're seeing evidence of drought in Egypt. So very briefly, you now know what the Antonine plague was. You know what made it susceptible: trade, military movements, and its environmental context. I just want to spend a few minutes just to close speaking a little bit about kind of some of the broader effects of the Antonine plague on the Pax Romana. So obviously it killed, the plague killed many in the cities and among the military. Of course, labor shortages would have followed as people died. Mines were shut down due to a lack of workers. Fields went fallow, and the war in Germany that the emperors had hoped to start ends up becoming a quagmire that lasted decades and resulted in a border along the northern Roman Empire that would be porous for centuries. So what are we looking at on your screen? We can see how bad it gets from a chart like this one. A team composed of scientists, archaeologists, historians pulled ice cores from Greenland showing thousands of years of lead emissions in the atmosphere. So why are lead emissions important? When Roman mines and mints smelted silver, lead particles wafted up into the atmosphere. They blew over into Greenland and then fell with the snow. And so these trace amounts of lead could be found in the ice cores. And what we see in these cores is that lead emissions decline during the 2nd century AD, and there's quite an accelerated drop. Again, it just coincides right with the advent of the Antonine Plague. So what this means almost certainly is that mining activity in the Northern Hemisphere, especially in Western Europe, declined sharply following the Antonine Plague. And by the way, again, if we were to extend this chart out centuries, this was a permanent drop. So if we took this all the way to the time of Charlemagne, it would still, the lead emissions would still be lower. The smelting, silver minting, smelting activity would all be low. So the damage that occurred outlasted the Roman Empire itself. We see evidence that there was a serious problem with silver shortages in the biography of Marcus Aurelius, and we have corroborating sources for this event. What we're told is that Marcus basically had to hold, I'm speaking to a British audience, so I don't want to say yard sale, a car boot sale with all of the tap from the imperial palace. He starts dragging it out into the Roman Forum, selling it over a span of 2 months to try to raise money to fund the state. That's how bad things got. We also see evidence of just how bad things were in the debasement of the silver denarius. So on the left side of your screen, you're seeing the amount of silver content in grams in the main silver coin, the denarius, fairly stable. And then through the Antonine Plague, reasonably stable, but then a precipitous drop from the late 170s of the silver content in the silver denarius. So that is obviously also a huge issue affecting the Roman Empire at the time. I don't want to end that. There's really, I don't want to end on a complete downer. So I'll leave you with a bit of silver lining in what is otherwise a pretty depressing story about pandemic and the end of the Pax Romana. Marcus Aurelius would reign from the year AD 161 to his death in 180. So what that means is during almost all of his years in power, the Antonine Plague, plus these other crises, military crisis, war, he even had some rebellion in Egypt. All of these things were constant companions to him for the rest of his life. And near the end of his life, he decided to pen some kind of private philosophical notes to himself. We call these the Meditations, and they survive to this day. And they give us really unique insight into the mind of a Roman Empire dealing with such calamities. A man who ruled Rome when its golden age actually ended, and we have his notes. The Meditations remind Marcus, he spends most of his writing in the Meditations basically reminding himself to be sober-minded and courageous and virtuous, even in the midst of death. He actually only references the Antonine Plague one time. And there are 12 books in the Meditations, and just once does he say something about pestilence. And this is what he says: "Has experience not yet persuaded you to flee from the pestilence of falsehood, pretense, luxury, and pride? For corruption of the mind is a far graver pestilence than any comparable disturbance and alteration in the air that surrounds us. For the one is a plague to living creatures as mere animals, and the other to human beings in their nature as human beings." I think what we're reading here is the account of a man who realized he could not rescue the Roman Empire, that its problems were too pernicious and too systemic. But he could face his dying world and really his own death with bravery and dignity. So Sickness had taken his soldiers and his friends, perhaps even members of his family, we don't know. Maybe even his co-emperor Lucius Verus. But here, in this part of the Meditations, the plague's presence really provokes a meaningful reflection on what death was and what it was not, how a courageous person should face the one sure thing about life, and that is that life ends. But at least Marcus says, let it end with character. Let it end with honesty, authenticity, and humility. So I'll end my remarks there. I'll just say, as Tim mentioned, this talk is just part of a much larger piece of research that I did. You're welcome to check that out in the book, Pox Romana. And you're also, if you'd like to check out my weekly podcast, the Pax Romana podcast, you can do so as well. And with that, I'm really looking forward to taking questions or hearing your comments. So yeah, thank you very much for your attention.
Okay, yes, thank you very much, Colin. For any academics watching, that is how you do a PowerPoint presentation. So excellent, thank you very much. As for Marcus Aurelius, I guess you would have to be a Stoic to cope with the circumstances of his reign, wouldn't you? I think that'd be the only way that you'd actually get through it.
Yep, I think so.
So we've got about 10 minutes for questions. So thank you for those of you who've sent them in. So we'll try and rattle through as many of these as we can. So just starting with, you mentioned this quarry in London that had been filled in. Is there any evidence that that could have been a plague pit?
Well, we would want to see bodies, and from what I can tell, we didn't find bodies. Now, there have been some potential plague pits. One in Gloucester Road, which does have just around 100 bodies in it. They were not damaged in any way, like they don't show evidence of violence or anything like that. So we do find at least one potential plague pit in Great Britain. The archaeologists that excavated that wrote a report, I think it's around 2011, and I'm sorry, I don't remember the name of it, something like Life and Death in a Roman Town, maybe, or something like that. And it's great. It's really detailed about these are people in the prime of their lives, all suddenly dying. And so there is potential for a plague pit there, but I don't know of any bodies that were found in the quarry.
Yeah, I think that's one of the misconceptions about looking at bones, isn't it? They don't actually tell you too much about how someone died unless there's like a very obvious axe wound to the head or something like that. Yeah. And if you have a very acute disease that kills somebody in a matter of days, it may not find itself, recorded in the bones. So it's trickier than you think it would be. So you talked about depopulation, and so one of our guests is wondering about repopulation. So once you get a village or a town that's been denuded, do you see these being repopulated? And if they have been, if the population has been devastated by pandemic disease, does that open them up to invasion or exploitation from neighboring areas that haven't been affected to the same extent?
Yeah, historians debate this because our figures for population in the Roman Empire are so tenuous, and quite frankly, they're in many ways just kind of educated guesses. That's the academic way of saying we throw darts at the wall and try to figure it out. So there are some historians that think, yes, there was a population drop, and then there must have been a pretty quick rebound for a variety of reasons, economic reasons, social reasons, just population pressure, so on and so forth. There are other historians that think that the Antonine plague was a kind of fatal blow to the population of the Roman Empire, and it dies down. What was the second part of your question again, Tim, or the guest's question?
Yeah, so the extent that if you weaken the population, it can make them susceptible to invasion or exploitation from a neighboring tribe or country.
Yeah, that's right. So we do see evidence of this in Egypt. So regardless of how people in the villages of the Nile Delta died, what we do see is at that exact same time as these populations are diminishing, again, evidence of bandits, revolution even in that part of the world. As people are fleeing the villages, they're going places. They're going into the countryside. They're forming bandits. A lot of the soldiers that leave the service as the war with the Germans drags on and becomes, quite frankly, very unfun for a Roman soldier who wants to just spend a bunch of time fighting a war that seems like cannot be won, which is not producing the kind of gains. So many of them seek fortunes elsewhere by forming roving bands of bandits and then attacking parts of their own Roman Empire, and leaving in places which had obviously become weakened. So we see those attacks in Asia Minor and Italy, places which had almost certainly faced the brunt of the Antonine plague. It doesn't affect everybody everywhere in the same way. North Africa, it seems to do just fine during the Antonine plague, but those regions that were weakened by the pandemic, indeed, as the guest surmises, seem to experience pretty terrible fallout from invasion in the aftermath.
Yeah. So, I mean, if there's a motto from this story, it's "Don't upset Apollo," right? And so Brianna is wondering about the sort of religious explanations for the origins of the disease. So are there existing accounts that sort of demonstrate sort of faith-related suspicion or attitudes about the plague, or explanations for the origins coming from the major religions of the time, and sort of the corollary of that, does it make people shift religions if they see that one set of gods has abandoned them or has punished them, and they perhaps move in a different direction?
Yeah, this is a great question. It's one that I was very curious about myself, and I'll share a little bit about what I've found. So yes, the origins in impiety are crucial for the Romans. They do not see diseases as primarily medical phenomena, but as religious phenomena. These are caused by some deity or deities being very upset. And there needs to be some kind of act of sacrilege that must have made them upset. It's not just capricious anger. Somebody did something, or some group of somebodies did something. So in the case of the Solution Shrine, that story is probably more about the general that was in charge. His name was Avidius Cassius, and he just let his soldiers ransack the city. And he is actually the guy who later on in 175 AD will rebel against Marcus Aurelius. He betrays his own emperor. That is a great act of sacrilege. And so part of that story must be a way to explain the Antonine plague and attach it basically to Avidius Cassius. Like, that's a tremendous act of impiety, and the gods will punish that, gods like Apollo. But we also see this on the small scale. So there are numerous cities in Asia Minor that erect statues or inscribe on stone elaborate rites of purification to deal with the disease. And many of these are focused on the traditional gods, Apollo, Artemis, gods that have maybe some relationship to disease in some way. There's also scapegoating that we see in at least one of those inscriptions, where anybody in the city that does not participate in the mitigation measures, washing the walls of the city, sacrificing animals in a certain way, anybody that doesn't participate, the god will burn with fire. And that might not mean literal fire. That might mean they might get sick. They might get fever. And so, yes, we see both a turn towards religious explanations and also some scapegoating. Now, maybe the question behind that question, of course, is about Christians. I really was hoping to find some very clear link between Christian persecution and the Antonine plague. We don't have a definite link. We don't have a source that says Christians were persecuted because of the Antonine plague. But the chronology of Christian persecution lines up in an interesting way with the Antonine plague, certainly suggesting some correlation. The very first large-scale kind of mass murder of Christians in the provinces happens in Lugdunum, modern Lyon, France, right around the time of the Antonine plague. 50 or so men, women, and children are killed. They're killed whether they recanted or did not, which is not the way Christian persecution normally works in the Roman Empire. Their bodies are burned and thrown into the river. This is what tends to happen in acts of kind of appeasement to the underworld gods, gods that would be responsible for plagues and disease. So there's no clear link there, but Christian persecution does ramp up at the time of the Antonine Plague, and they are a group that does not participate in the traditional religious rituals that would have been seen to mitigate diseases like the Antonine Plague. There seems like there could be a link there.
Yeah, interesting. So we're running out of time, but it's interesting that the sort of you can see parallels with more modern outbreaks and pandemics in terms of a sort of a secular scapegoating, you know, so people aren't following social distancing or public health advice. So you know, we never change that much, do we really? So I just apologies to those who I haven't got round to asking questions, but we're almost up against time. But again, you might find the answers if you go out and purchase this, which is an excellent book. Mine is free, but I would happily have paid for this because it's a very, very good book. And so you can get that from Fox Lane Books. Other booksellers available, but do have a look at Fox Lane. They're a nice independent bookseller. So it just remains for me to just remind everybody that you will find a recording of this event. If you go through the York Ideas YouTube channel, you'll see in the Watch Again link, but you should get a link emailed to you following this presentation. So I just want to again say a big thank you to Colin. That was an erudite, informative, I would like to say entertaining, but you have been describing death and misery on a grand scale, but you somehow managed to do it. So thank you once again. Very grateful that you were able to join us this evening.
Cheers, Tim. And thank you to you and to the organizers as well. So it was a real treat.
Yeah. Thanks again. Thank you.